Hey there, everybody. I woke up pissed today, and you get to hear about it. So, one of the things we've talked a lot about during the Trump era is the importance of not falling for fake news, is the importance of checking your sources and making sure that you're not getting your worldview from xpatriotgun.biz, but that you're reading legacy media sources, that you're reading the Washington Post, for instance, to which I recently had a subscription, that you're doing your due diligence, right? I want to talk a little bit today about how that's not enough, and I want to talk a little bit about how people are trying to sell you bad political science. And we'll get to that, circle around to that at the end, but for now, let's take a look at the story, today's story in the Washington Post. GOP leaders' embrace of Trump's refusal to concede fits pattern of rising authoritarianism, data shows. And immediately go, data, this is going to be scientific, this is going to be objective. Data shows that the GOP has rising authoritarianism. Research by a team of international scholars, very serious, shows that the Republican Party's shift away from democratic norms, predates Donald Trump but has accelerated since. And they go through and they lay out some stuff where basically, what you see is Republican Party backslides towards authoritarianism. Look, the blue line goes straight across at highest, and the number drops down to the GOP. You got that. Looks really bad. Demonization of opponents becomes routine. Dems stay at usually not. Republicans were right there until about 2000 and looks like 6-ish, 7-ish. And then it just starts cratering. And all the way down to always. So this looks bad, right? But a couple things should be setting off your alarms at first. As far as data goes, this is not a super data-y y-axis. Just never, usually, not half the time, usually, always. Right here, it just says highest and lowest. You have no idea what the data is that they're measuring just by looking at these. So that's the first thing that should ping a thing in your head. And then, so I went, okay, this looks a little fishy to me. Let's look up who's doing it. Lerman, who's one of the people behind this particular research, is deputy director of the university's V-Dem Institute. V-Dem is short for Varieties of Democracy. It's a big database which, as this discussed here, tries to measure very hard-to-measure values in political science by polling political scientists, by asking a bunch of political scientists, how would you rate this issue, this country on this issue, this country on that issue, usually just in the terms that we've seen on the graph. Is this happening in this country? Always, most of the time, about half the time, almost never, never. And they just do that. That's the way the Varieties of Democracy database comes up with their information. I'm here to tell you that from within the profession, in conversations that, most people don't have access to, the VDem database, Varieties of Democracy, is considered to be a bit of a laughingstock. People still use it, but the people who take data really seriously in political science, the people who are really trying to solve the sorts of problems that lead to, for instance, a 7-point misjudge of the polls in a major presidential election, the people who are really trying to deal seriously with those problems, they do not take the Varieties of Democracy database seriously. The most basic reason for this should be obvious. The Varieties of Democracy database isn't measuring a particular political outcome. It's not measuring whether, the amount of people thrown in prison by a government goes up over a certain period of time. It's just asking political scientists what they think. This is great if you want to know what political scientists think. And political scientists probably know a bit more about political science and about politics than the average person in the audience. But political scientists also have systematic biases that they have to deal with and that they try to accommodate in their research. The VDem database doesn't deal with at all. Political scientists are about 90-10, I've seen, Democrat to Republican. If you put it non-Trump supporter to Trump supporter, it's about 99-1. So, against a backdrop like that, how likely is it going to be that the political scientists you poll might be harder on a conservative political party, especially a nationalist conservative political party, than they would be on a Democratic party or on a party that they're probably members of. Pretty high, right? Like, these are, and this is not a right-winger screaming the bias of the academia. These are what my left-wing research professors who take this really seriously would call confounding variables. You have factors that are going into the data that you're discussing that are not being controlled for in the data. They didn't control for, Varieties of Democracy doesn't control for the fact that political scientists tend to all have one particular political affiliation or ideological outlook. They'll do that with the population. They'll weight your vote differently based on whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, because you might be confused by your biases towards this party or that party, depending on the question they're asking. But we political scientists, we don't have to worry about that. We're more mature than that. We're more rational than that. We're beyond that. So that's the Varieties of Democracy database, problem number one. Problem number two, they conflate authoritarianism, autocracy, and non-democracy in the article. And you go, okay, those all sound kind of the same. But let's look at some of the things that they measured. They asked the political scientists to talk about. These are like the different scales, different issue areas that they quizzed on. Like, what is the GOP like? What are the Democrats like on these questions? So, non-pluralist, less likely to tolerate a wide variety of people. Is that anti-democratic? Like, I think a democracy, I value pluralism deeply. It's maybe my core political value. But if a majority of people votes to have a less pluralistic society, if they vote to have a society that, for instance, let's go down a little lower, make this more obvious, that restricts immigration. If you're anti-immigration, does that mean you're anti-democratic? What if the demos, the people, votes and they don't want more immigration? To plug, or opposes LGBT equality. I support LGBT equality, but if the majority of people want to make gay marriage illegal again, that is not anti-democratic. It is not autocratic to say that you support that. What it is bad. It's bad. But to conflate all of these different measures, now some of these are more obvious. Violates minority rights, sure. Disrespects opponents, like, I guess that seems really broad, and I find it very hard to believe that the Democrats don't disrespect their opponents more in 2018 than they do in 2000. I think we can see that it's obvious that rhetoric on the left has ramped up, but it's just not obvious to these political scientists, right? Encourages violence, definitely anti-democratic, definitely a threat to free and fair elections. Anti-elitist? Anti-elitist feeds into a measure of how anti-democratic a party is, how autocratic a party is. That doesn't seem obvious to me at all. And so here's the point. Sure, this is in the article, and to be clear, I want to give credit to the article. The article discusses the fact that it's a poll of scientists. But the thing that it can't show you, poll of political scientists, excuse me, the thing that it can't show you is the way in which political science is trying to take these problems more seriously. The way in which I shared this, and immediately my friends in grad school were rolling their eyes at it, and a lot of them think that the GOP is more authoritarian than they were 4 years ago. I believe the GOP, or let's say 10 years ago, I believe the GOP is more authoritarian than it was 10 years ago. But they also know that this measure, the Varieties of Democracy measure, is a joke. They also know, we've learned our methodology. I screwed up, and I really should have taken language and done a translation because I'm a political theorist. I didn't. I took advanced methodology courses. We know that the methodology on this is unsatisfactory. But here's the problem. That doesn't come across to you, a person who has a lot better things to do than study this boring bullshit. It doesn't come across to you, even if you're doing everything right in your media literacy diet. Even if you're reading sources like the Washington Post that fact-check well and that correct their errors and that aren't like, XPatriotGun.biz. Like, this never comes across to you. And if it did come across to you, it would be in an article like, political scientists are trying to deal with these massive measurement issues, you're more likely to see that around polling right now. But you're not going to get into the weeds in terms of varieties of democracy versus Freedom House versus, one of the other dozen indices that people use, none of which are really any good, by the way. All of which deal with massive, massive problems in their reliability. There are all these different measures of democracy, little glimpse on this, all these different measures of democracy, all these different indices that different think tanks come out to measure democracy. And the problem is, and people go, okay, one of the arguments they make for them is, well, these must be honing in on something real because obviously they're all coming up with sort of the similar answers, right? Sometimes they come up with similar answers because they're using the same Excel sheets. And then people will take two databases that use the same Excel sheet for their base data, and they say, I now have two sources that support my opinion, when it's one source. I want to bring this across to you. I'm not going to take too much longer. But the point is, it's really that bad. It's really just that bad. And you wouldn't know about it if you didn't have a crazy, dumbass friend on your Facebook feed who has decided to pay attention to this stuff in a really deep, rigorous, commit your life to it kind of way. So, if you're looking for a solution at the end of this video, I don't really know what to tell you. Because it's unrealistic of you to go through an advanced methodology course. Like, that's just not going to work, and you should not have to spend the time doing that. But the point being, even if you see it in the Washington Post, I guess the most basic thing would be, if that y-axis looks like this, never, always, or if the y-axis looks like highest, lowest, less, more, start squinting. Start wondering, because that is just a bunch of political scientists filling out a dot on a form, or they say pick a number between 1 and 100. That's it. If you see that, start to squint, start to be skeptical, and know the biases of the professions that are feeding you this information and that are presenting this information uncritically to news sources. But this mostly isn't on you. This is mostly on political science to be more responsible and to not allow themselves to be this cheap. And I just couldn't let it go by sitting here without saying something, without doing my little bit to correct the record on this. Varieties of Democracy is trash. Political scientists should be better than this. And you need a more rigorous check if you're going to do political scientists than do all my colleagues agree with me. You just do. We're beyond that. Or we should be. But apparently we're not. So, I don't know. In a fucked up world, we just got locked down again. I hope this can help in some way. Thanks for listening.